April 1841, Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. The first sign appeared on the third Tuesday of the month, when the noon bell at the Church of the Immaculate Conception rang 6 times instead of 12, stopped for the span of 3 heartbeats, then resumed its proper count. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from, and what's the time in the comments. Eugénie Duplantier-Broussard stood at the window of the withdrawing room, one hand pressed to the sill, the other holding a glass of tonic water tinted faintly amber by the chemist's arsenical preparation prescribed for her monthly complaints. She had taken the remedy daily since late February, when Dr. Émile Lavergne had written the instruction in his clear hand, 2 drachms in water before noon, to correct the nervous debility common to women of refinement. The bell's interruption caused her to set the glass down without drinking. Her husband, Colonel Jacques Broussard, sat at the rosewood secretary in the corner, where he had remained since breakfast, working through the ledger that governed their lives. The pages bore notations in black ink: cotton yields, slave rations distributed by the overseer Mathieu Gagnon, payments owed to the Mechanics and Traders Bank of New Orleans. The mortgage, secured in 1836 against 68 acres and 19 souls, had been extended twice, most recently in October 1840, when the bank had added the new debt to the original note without updating the parish register. Colonel Broussard did not look up when the bell faltered. Eugénie turned from the window. The light entering the room was the white gold of Louisiana spring, filtered through muslin curtains that Hélène, her lady's maid, had washed in starch 3 days prior. Beyond the glass lay the front gallery, its cypress boards painted dove gray, and beyond that the gravel drive bordered by live oaks trained with Spanish moss. The plantation house stood 2 stories, raised on brick piers to guard against the spring floods that came when the Red River swelled. It was called Bel Ombre, though no deed bore that name. The colonel had christened it thus in 1834, the year he brought Eugénie from her father's house in New Orleans. She crossed to the sideboard and retrieved the glass. The tonic tasted of minerals and faint bitterness, qualities Dr. Lavergne had assured her were marks of efficacy. She drank half, then set it aside. The colonel turned a page. Outside, the bell resumed its silence. The household rose each day to a pattern fixed by season and custom. At 5 in the morning, the overseer rang the iron triangle that hung from the oak nearest the quarters, summoning the field hands to their first assembly. By 6, the house servants had lit the fires in the kitchen, a separate structure 30 paces behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway of packed oyster shell. Breakfast arrived at 7. Coffee brought from New Orleans in burlap sacks, cornbread baked in the Dutch oven, ham from the smokehouse, sometimes eggs if the hens had been productive. The colonel took his meal in the dining room, reading correspondence. Eugénie took hers on a tray in the withdrawing room, where the morning light was gentler. On Tuesdays and Fridays, Hélène drew water from the cistern and heated it for Eugénie's bath, a ritual that required 2 hours and the labor of 3 house servants. The tub, enameled white with claw feet, had been shipped upriver from New Orleans in pieces and reassembled in the chamber adjacent to the bedroom. Eugénie bathed in water scented with lavender oil purchased from the apothecary Monsieur Thibault, whose shop stood on Front Street in Natchitoches, a half-day's journey by carriage when the roads permitted. The tonic had been compounded by Monsieur Thibault in February, after Eugénie's visit to Dr. Lavergne's office on Rue Royale. She had complained of fatigue, of headaches that arrived with the afternoon heat, of a sensation she described as tightness in the chest. Dr. Lavergne had listened, made notes, then written the prescription: arsenical solution, 2 drachms daily, a common treatment for disorders of the feminine constitution. The doctor's fee had been $5, noted in the colonel's ledger under the heading Medical. The mortgage consumed the colonel's attention as April progressed. The note owed to the Mechanics and Traders Bank stood at $11,000, with interest compounding at 10% per annum. The original sum, advanced in 1836, had been $6,000. The difference represented 4 years of poor cotton harvests, a failed attempt to plant sugarcane in soil better suited to corn, and the cost of replacing 3 field hands lost to fever in the summer of 1838. The bank had sent 2 letters in March, each delivered by a courier who rode from Natchitoches with documents sealed in oilcloth. Colonel Broussard had read them alone in his study, then burned them in the hearth. Foreclosure proceedings in Louisiana required judicial action, a process that began with the creditor petitioning the parish court for an order of seizure and sale. The court, situated in Natchitoches, convened on the first Monday of each month with Judge Armand Prudhomme presiding. Once the order issued, the sheriff posted notice at the courthouse door and in the parish newspaper, the Natchitoches Courier, announcing the date of public auction. Properties offered for sale included land, buildings, equipment, livestock, and slaves, all itemized in the sheriff's inventory. Purchasers paid in cash or certified bank drafts. The proceeds first satisfied the mortgage debt, with any remainder returned to the debtor. Eugénie knew none of these details. Her education, conducted at the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, had covered music, French literature, needlework, and the management of a Christian household, but not the mechanics of debt. She knew the colonel spent long hours at the secretary, that his expression darkened when the post arrived, that he had ceased ordering wine from the merchant who supplied the house with Bordeaux and Madeira. She did not ask questions. Ladies of her station did not involve themselves in commerce. The tonic bottle stood on the sideboard in the withdrawing room, a clear glass vessel with a paper label inked in Monsieur Thibault's script. Liquor arsenicalis, 2 drachms in water, daily before noon. Beside it sat a ceramic measure marked in drachms, and beside that, a carafe of water drawn fresh each morning from the cistern. Hélène prepared the dose at 11:30, measuring the arsenical solution with care, then mixing it into a glass of water. She brought the glass to Eugénie on a small silver tray, set it on the side table, and withdrew without speaking. The routine held through the 3rd week of April. Eugénie drank her tonic at midday. The colonel worked at his ledger. The field hands planted cotton in rows plotted by the overseer, who walked the acreage with a surveyor's chain and wooden stakes. In the kitchen, the cook, a woman named Céleste, who had been purchased in New Orleans in 1835, prepared the evening meal. Chicken stewed with okra, rice boiled in an iron pot, cornbread with molasses. The house servants ate after the family had finished, taking their portions at a table in the rear gallery. On the 24th of April, a Friday, Eugénie woke before dawn with nausea that persisted through the morning. She took no breakfast, only weak tea brought by Hélène, who hovered in the doorway until dismissed. At 11:30, the maid returned with the tonic. Eugénie drank it, then lay down on the daybed in the withdrawing room, a pillow beneath her head. The nausea subsided by afternoon, replaced by a dull ache in her limbs. She attributed it to the heat, which had risen unseasonably, turning the air thick and still. That evening, Colonel Broussard informed her that they would host a dinner on the first Sunday of May, following the morning service at the Church of the Immaculate Conception. The occasion, he explained, was a gesture of goodwill toward certain gentlemen of the parish whose favor he sought to retain. He provided a list of names: Judge Prudhomme, Monsieur Alphonse Metoyer, who owned the adjoining plantation, and Monsieur Etienne Cloutier, a cotton factor with offices in New Orleans and Natchitoches. Eugénie listened, nodded, then summoned Céleste to discuss the menu. Preparations for the dinner occupied the final week of April. Eugénie composed the guest list in her daybook, noting the number of place settings required, the arrangement of the table, the order of courses. She consulted with Céleste on provisions: a ham to be baked with cloves and brown sugar, a roast of beef, potatoes creamed with butter, greens dressed in vinegar, a trifle layered with custard and jam. The colonel authorized the purchase of 2 bottles of wine from the merchant in Natchitoches, a departure from recent economy that Eugénie noted but did not question. On the 28th, a Monday, Hélène washed and pressed the linens for the dining room, a damask tablecloth embroidered with fleur-de-lis, napkins folded into bishop's hats, placemats edged in lace. The silver, forks, knives, spoons inherited from Eugenie's grandmother, was polished with ash and soft cloth until it gleamed. The chandelier, a brass fixture hung with crystal drops, was lowered by pulley so that each prism could be wiped free of dust. Candles, white beeswax bought in bulk from a chandler in New Orleans, were fitted into the sconces throughout the dining room and front parlor. Eugenie's symptoms returned on the 29th. She woke with a metallic taste in her mouth, a dryness in the throat that water did not relieve. Her hands trembled as she dressed, a fine tremor that made fastening buttons difficult. Hélène helped her into a day gown of pale blue cotton, laced at the back, with sleeves gathered at the shoulder. Eugenie descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, and took her place in the withdrawing room. At 11:30, Hélène brought the tonic. Eugenie drank it, felt the bitterness coat her tongue, then set the glass aside. The room seemed to tilt slightly, a vertigo that passed after several breaths. She remained seated, hands folded in her lap, until the sensation faded. That afternoon, Colonel Broussard received a visitor. The man arrived on horseback, dismounting at the front steps and handing the reins to the stable boy, a child of 11 named Baptiste. The colonel met him in the study, a ground-floor room lined with shelves holding account books, maps of the parish, and a Bible bound in cracked leather. The door closed. Voices murmured behind it for an hour, too low for words to be distinguished. When the visitor departed, the colonel remained in the study until supper. The household schedule continued without alteration. Morning bell at 5, breakfast at 7. Field hands assembled by the overseer who distributed tools, hoes, rakes, cotton sacks, and assigned rows. Midday meal at noon, cornbread, beans cooked with fatback, water drawn from the well. Work resumed at 1 and continued until 6, when the bell rang again, releasing the hands to the quarters. House servants moved through their routines, fires lit, floors swept, chamber pots emptied, linens changed. Celeste prepared supper in the kitchen, sending dishes to the dining room via Hélène, who carried them on trays covered with cloth to keep the heat. On the 30th, Eugenie spent the morning reviewing the arrangements for Sunday's dinner. She walked through the dining room, inspecting the table, adjusting the placement of a fork, straightening a napkin. The room smelled of beeswax and lemon oil, the latter used to polish the mahogany sideboard. Sunlight entered through tall windows draped in velvet, pooling on the floor in oblongs of gold. She stood at the head of the table, imagining the guests seated, the candles lit, the courses served in sequence. At 11:30, she returned to the withdrawing room for her tonic. Hélène had already prepared it, the glass waiting on the silver tray. Eugenie drank, tasted the familiar bitterness, then noticed an aftertaste she could not identify. Sharper than usual, almost acrid. She mentioned it to Hélène, who examined the bottle, sniffed the contents, then shook her head. The solution appeared unchanged, clear, faintly amber, with no sediment or cloudiness. That night Eugenie woke in darkness, seized by cramps that radiated from her abdomen to her back. She rose from bed, fumbled for the chamber pot, and vomited a thin, bitter fluid. The spasms continued for several minutes, leaving her weak and trembling. She rang the bell for Hélène, who arrived with a candle, her face creased with concern. Eugenie asked for water. Hélène fetched a pitcher and glass, then helped her mistress back into bed. The cramps subsided by dawn, replaced by exhaustion so profound that Eugenie could not rise for breakfast. Colonel Broussard sent for Dr. Lavergne on the 1st of May, a Saturday. The physician arrived in the late afternoon, traveling from Natchitoches in a cabriolet, drawn by a single horse. He examined Eugenie in her chamber, asking questions about her symptoms, palpating her abdomen, checking her pulse. She described the nausea, the cramps, the metallic taste. Dr. Lavergne nodded, made notes in a leather-bound journal, then prescribed a continuation of the arsenical tonic, along with a decoction of peppermint and chamomile to settle the stomach. He attributed her condition to nervous strain, common among women of delicate temperament, exacerbated by the approaching heat of summer. He advised rest, bland foods, and avoidance of excitement. The consultation lasted 30 minutes. The colonel paid him $10, noted in the ledger. Sunday arrived clear and warm, with a breeze from the southwest carrying the scent of magnolia. The household rose early for the journey to church, a distance of 6 miles along a road rutted by spring rains. Colonel Broussard drove the carriage, a 4-wheeled barouche drawn by a matched pair of bay horses. Eugénie sat beside him, dressed in a gown of dove-gray silk, a bonnet tied beneath her chin with ribbon. Hélène followed in a wagon driven by the overseer, accompanied by Céleste, and 2 house servants tasked with transporting the food prepared for the dinner. The Church of the Immaculate Conception stood on the outskirts of Natchitoches, a whitewashed structure with a bell tower visible for miles. Mass began at 9, conducted by Father Lucien Bérard, who intoned the liturgy in Latin while the congregation knelt on wooden pews. Eugénie prayed with her missal open, though her attention drifted, pulled toward the ache in her stomach and the weariness that clung to her limbs. The bell rang at the elevation of the host, 12 clear chimes that echoed through the nave. She crossed herself, rose, took communion, then returned to her seat. After Mass, the congregation lingered in the churchyard, exchanging greetings, discussing weather and crops. Colonel Broussard spoke with Judge Prudhomme, a stout man with silver side whiskers and a watch chain looped across his waistcoat. Monsieur Metoyer joined them, followed by Monsieur Cloutier, who had traveled from New Orleans for the occasion. Eugénie stood apart, shaded by a parasol held by Hélène, responding to pleasantries from the wives of neighboring planters. At 10:30, the party departed for Belle Ombre. The dinner commenced at noon. Guests assembled in the front parlor, where the colonel served sherry in crystal glasses, a ritual of hospitality that preceded the meal. Conversation turned to politics, rumors of unrest in Mexico, debates over tariffs in Congress, topics the men pursued while the women admired the parlor's furnishings, a pianoforte imported from France, a gilt-framed mirror, porcelain figurines arranged on the mantelpiece. At 12:15, Eugénie invited the company to the dining room. The seating had been arranged according to precedence. Judge Prudhomme occupied the chair to Eugénie's right, his position marking his status as the most distinguished guest. Colonel Broussard sat opposite his wife at the far end of the table, with Monsieur Cloutier to his left and Monsieur Metoyer to his right. The wives of the latter 2 gentlemen, Madame Cloutier, a woman of 30 with delicate features, and Madame Metoyer, older and more severe, sat between the men, the arrangement designed to separate married couples and encourage conversation. Hélène and another house servant, a girl named Amélie, moved between the dining room and kitchen, carrying dishes under cloth covers. The first course arrived at 12:20, a consommé of beef, clarified until it gleamed amber in the candlelight, served in porcelain bowls painted with pastoral scenes. Eugénie lifted her spoon, tasted, set it down. The soup was rich, but her appetite had abandoned her. She glanced down the table at her husband, who was speaking to Monsieur Cloutier about cotton prices in New Orleans. The conversation proceeded through channels dictated by custom. Judge Prudhomme inquired after Eugénie's health, a polite opening that required a polite deflection. She assured him she was well, merely fatigued by the preparations for the dinner. He nodded, turned to the topic of the spring planting, which had been delayed by rains in late March. Madame Cloutier spoke of her children, 2 boys under the age of 5, left in New Orleans with a nurse. Madame Metoyer discussed the upcoming Ascension Day celebrations, scheduled for mid-May, which would include a procession from the church to the cemetery. The ham arrived, glazed with molasses and studded with cloves, accompanied by creamed potatoes and greens wilted in pork fat. Colonel Broussard carved, distributing portions with the precision of a quartermaster. Eugénie accepted a small serving, cut a piece, brought it to her mouth. The meat was tender, but the taste turned metallic on her tongue, an echo of the sensation that had troubled her for days. She chewed, swallowed, reached for her wine glass. The Bordeaux, dark and slightly bitter, masked the aftertaste. At 1:30, the beef arrived. A roast cooked until the exterior charred and the interior remained pink. Celeste had prepared a sauce of pan drippings thickened with flour, seasoned with thyme and black pepper. The aroma filled the dining room, mingling with the scent of beeswax and the faint sweetness of the trifle waiting on the sideboard. Judge Prudhomme praised the meal, addressing his compliments to Eugénie, who inclined her head in acknowledgement. The colonel refilled the wine glasses, his movements steady, his expression unreadable. The men's conversation shifted to politics. Monsieur Cloutier reported that the Bankruptcy Act, passed by Congress in August of the previous year, had been repealed in March, leaving debtors once again without federal protection. Judge Prudhomme noted that several planters in the parish had filed for relief under the act before its repeal, discharging debts that would otherwise have consumed their estates. Colonel Broussard listened without comment, his knife working methodically across his plate. Eugénie felt the heat rising in the room, despite the windows open to admit the afternoon breeze. A faint perspiration formed on her brow, dampening the hair at her temples. She dabbed her forehead with her napkin, folded it, returned it to her lap. Her hands trembled slightly, a fine vibration that she tried to conceal by clasping them together beneath the table. The tremor had begun 3 days prior and had worsened each morning. Madame Cloutier asked about the garden at Belle Ombre, which Eugénie had planted in 1835 with roses imported from a nursery in Mobile. The question required a response, and Eugénie summoned the words, describing the varieties, Noisette, Bourbon, a single Alba, and their progress through the spring. She spoke slowly, aware that her voice lacked its usual steadiness. Madame Metoyer listened, interjected a remark about her own garden, which had suffered from aphids in April. The conversation moved forward, a current that carried Eugénie without effort on her part. The trifle was served at 2:15. Layers of sponge cake soaked in sherry, custard flavored with vanilla, and raspberry jam preserved from the previous summer. Eugénie took a small portion, tasted, found it too sweet. She set her spoon aside, reached again for her wine glass, realized it was empty. Hélène refilled it without being asked, her movements silent and efficient. By 3 o'clock, the meal concluded. The ladies withdrew to the front parlor, leaving the men to their cigars and brandy in the dining room. Eugénie led the way, moving slowly to mask the unsteadiness in her gait. Her feet felt numb, as though wrapped in layers of wool, a sensation that had begun the previous evening and had not abated. She settled into a chair near the window, where the light was diffuse and gentle. Madame Cloutier and Madame Metoyer took seats on the sofa, their conversation turning to topics deemed suitable for women, children, household management, the quality of cloth available from merchants in Natchitoches. Eugénie participated minimally, offering nods and murmurs of agreement. Her attention drifted to the dining room, where the men's voices rose and fell in patterns too indistinct to decipher. She heard her husband's voice, lower and more measured than the others. At 4 o'clock, the guests departed. Colonel Broussard accompanied them to the front gallery, shaking hands with the men, bowing to the ladies. Eugénie remained in the parlor, rising only when Madame Cloutier and Madame Metoyer approached to take their leave. She walked them to the door, stood on the gallery as the carriages rolled down the drive, then retreated into the house. The household resumed its ordinary rhythms. Hélène and Amélie cleared the dining room, stacking plates, folding linens, carrying remnants to the kitchen for Celeste to distribute among the house servants. Colonel Broussard retired to his study, closing the door behind him. Eugénie climbed the stairs to her chamber, each step requiring concentration, and lay down without removing her gown. She woke at dusk, her mouth dry and her limbs aching. The room had darkened. No one had come to light the candles. She rose, fumbled for the bell, rang it twice. Hélène appeared within minutes carrying a taper, her face shadowed with concern. Eugenie asked for water, which the maid fetched in a porcelain pitcher. She drank, felt the coolness slide down her throat, then asked Hélène to help her undress. The laces at the back of the gown had tightened during her rest, and her fingers lacked the strength to work them loose. Supper was taken in the dining room at 7, a simple meal of cold ham, cornbread and greens left from the afternoon. Colonel Broussard ate without speaking, his attention on a letter he had received during the dinner, delivered by a courier who had waited on the rear gallery until the guests departed. The letter bore the seal of the Mechanics and Traders Bank, impressed in red wax. Eugenie did not ask about its contents. That night she woke again to nausea, followed by cramps that seized her abdomen and radiated downward. She reached for the chamber pot, vomited a thin fluid that tasted of copper and bile. The spasms lasted 10 minutes, leaving her weak and shaking. She did not ring for Hélène, unwilling to summon the household for what she told herself was merely a digestive upset. By dawn, the symptoms had subsided, replaced by exhaustion and a dull headache that settled behind her eyes. Monday arrived with overcast skies and a humid stillness that pressed against the skin. Eugenie did not rise for breakfast. Hélène brought tea and toast to her chamber, setting the tray on the table beside the bed. Eugenie drank half the tea, left the toast untouched. At 11:30, the maid returned with the tonic, prepared as always, 2 drachms of arsenical solution in a glass of water. Eugenie drank it, tasted the bitterness, felt it settle in her stomach like a stone. Colonel Broussard sent for Dr. Lavergne on Tuesday. The physician arrived at noon, his black bag in hand, his expression grave. He examined Eugenie in her chamber, listening to her heart with an ear pressed to her chest, checking her pulse at the wrist and throat, palpating her abdomen until she winced. She described her symptoms: the nausea, the cramps, the numbness in her feet, the trembling in her hands. Dr. Lavergne made notes, asked questions about her diet, her sleep, her monthly courses. He prescribed a reduction in the arsenical tonic, 1 drachm instead of 2, and the addition of laudanum, 10 drops in water at bedtime to ease the pain and promote rest. He assured the colonel that his wife's condition was not grave, merely a consequence of her delicate constitution and the strain of recent social obligations. The consultation lasted 40 minutes. The fee was $12. The reduction in the tonic brought no relief. Eugenie's symptoms persisted through the 2nd week of May, fluctuating in intensity but never fully receding. The numbness spread from her feet to her calves, making walking difficult. The tremor in her hands became more pronounced, interfering with tasks that required fine control, fastening buttons, threading a needle, holding a teacup without spilling. Her appetite diminished to nothing. Meals brought to her chamber remained largely uneaten. Colonel Broussard spent his days in the study or in consultation with the overseer, who reported that the cotton crop was progressing adequately, but would require additional labor at harvest if the yield was to meet expectations. The colonel made no mention of hiring additional hands or purchasing slaves from the market in Natchitoches. The ledger remained on his desk, its pages filled with calculations that grew increasingly cramped as the margins filled. On the 15th, a Monday, a second letter arrived from the bank. Colonel Broussard read it in the study, then rode into Natchitoches without informing Eugenie of his destination. He returned at dusk, his face set in an expression that discouraged questions. That evening, he dined alone in the dining room, while Eugenie remained in her chamber, subsisting on broth and weak tea. The following day, he informed her that they would host another dinner on the Sunday after Ascension Day, an event he described as necessary to maintain their standing in the parish. Eugenie, propped against pillows in her bed, listened without objection. She lacked the strength to argue, and in truth, she did not fully comprehend the urgency her husband conveyed. He left the details to her discretion, as before, and withdrew. Preparations began the next day, though Eugenie directed them from her chamber rather than supervising in person. Hélène carried messages between mistress and cook, relaying instructions about the menu, the guest list, the arrangement of the table. Eugenie composed the invitations in a hand that wavered more than it had 2 weeks prior, the letters uneven, and the ink occasionally smudged where her trembling fingers brushed the page. She sealed them with wax, pressed her signet into the soft surface, and entrusted them to a servant for delivery. The guest list differed slightly from the first dinner. Judge Prudhomme would attend again, as would Monsieur Metoyer, but Monsieur Cloutier had returned to New Orleans and would be replaced by Monsieur Olivier Fontenot, a lawyer whose practice included debt collection and foreclosure proceedings. The addition of Monsieur Fontenot struck Eugenie as unusual, but she did not question it. Ladies of her station did not involve themselves in legal matters. Ascension Day arrived on Thursday, the 19th of May. The household attended Mass in Natchitoches, a service that began at 9 and concluded with a procession to the parish cemetery, where Father Bérard blessed the graves and led the congregation in prayers for the dead. Eugenie attended in a carriage, unable to walk the distance from the church to the cemetery without assistance. She remained seated during the procession, watching from the shade of a live oak as the parishioners filed past, carrying candles that guttered in the morning breeze. That evening, her symptoms worsened. The cramps returned with greater intensity, doubling her over until she could not straighten. Hélène summoned the colonel, who stood in the doorway of the chamber, observing without approaching. He asked if she wished him to send for Dr. Lavergne. Eugenie, gasping between spasms, shook her head. The physician had done nothing to alleviate her suffering. Another visit would be pointless. The colonel withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. The cramps subsided near midnight, leaving Eugenie too weak to rise from bed. Hélène remained in the chamber, dozing in a chair by the hearth, waking periodically to check on her mistress. In the morning, she brought the tonic at 11:30, as instructed, though the dosage had been reduced to 1 drachm. Eugenie drank it, tasted the bitterness, wondered briefly why the remedy prescribed for her health seemed to correlate with her decline. The thought drifted away, too elusive to hold, replaced by the fog of exhaustion. On Saturday, the household prepared for the Sunday dinner. Celeste worked in the kitchen from dawn until midday, roasting a leg of lamb, baking bread, churning butter, preparing vegetables brought from the garden by one of the field hands. Hélène washed the linens again, pressed the tablecloth until it lay smooth and crisp, polished the silver until it reflected the candlelight like mirrors. Eugenie remained in her chamber, conserving what little strength remained for the appearance she would be required to make the following day. Sunday morning broke clear and warm, with a southerly wind that carried the scent of rain still hours distant. The household rose early for the journey to church, a routine now so familiar it required no conscious thought. Eugenie dressed with Hélène's assistance, the maid lacing the stays loosely to accommodate her mistress's discomfort. The gown, pale green silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, hung more loosely than it had in April. She had lost weight, though she had not noticed the change herself. The carriage carried them to Natchitoches, arriving at the church 20 minutes before Mass. Eugenie sat in the same pew she had occupied 2 weeks prior, her missal open, her attention wandering. The liturgy proceeded without variation, the Latin phrases rising and falling in rhythms that had not changed in centuries. The bell rang at the elevation, 12 chimes that echoed through the nave. She closed her eyes, felt the sound vibrate in her chest, wondered why the bell's tone seemed sharper than before. After Mass, the congregation gathered in the churchyard. Colonel Broussard spoke with Judge Prudhomme and Monsieur Fontenot, the latter a thin man with a sharp nose and spectacles that caught the sunlight. Eugenie stood apart, leaning on Hélène's arm for support, responding to greetings from acquaintances with nods and faint smiles. At 11 o'clock, the party departed for Bel-Ombre. The dinner commenced at noon, following the same pattern as before. Guests assembled in the parlor for sherry, then moved to the dining room when Eugenie signaled readiness. The seating had been arranged according to precedence. Judge Prudhomme at Eugenie's right, Monsieur Fontenot to her left, the others distributed along the table's length. Colonel Broussard took his place at the far end opposite his wife, his expression composed. The first course arrived, a soup of spring peas, thickened with cream, garnished with mint. Eugenie lifted her spoon, tasted, set it down. She could not eat. Her stomach rebelled at the thought of food, and the effort required to maintain the appearance of normalcy exhausted what little energy remained. She glanced down the table at her husband, who raised his wine glass in a silent toast, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before shifting away. The lamb arrived at 12:15, roasted until the exterior darkened and the fat ran clear. Celeste had studded it with rosemary and garlic, wrapped it in cloth soaked in butter, cooked it slowly over coals banked in the kitchen hearth. The aroma filled the dining room as Hélène carried the platter to the table, setting it before the colonel, who carved with the same methodical precision he applied to all tasks. He served Judge Prudhomme first, then Monsieur Fontenot, then Monsieur Metoyer and his wife, working his way down the table until only Eugenie remained. He placed a modest portion on her plate, the meat glistening in the candlelight. She stared at it, felt her stomach contract, lifted her fork without conviction. The first bite required effort. The second was impossible. She set the fork aside, reached for her water glass, drank. The water tasted faintly metallic, an echo of the tonic she had consumed that morning at 11:30. Conversation flowed around her like a river around a stone. Judge Prudhomme spoke of a case recently adjudicated in his court, a dispute over boundary lines between two neighboring plantations, resolved by reference to a survey conducted in 1803, when Louisiana had passed from French to American hands. Monsieur Metoyer interjected a remark about his own boundaries, which had been contested 3 years prior and settled in his favor. Monsieur Fontenot listened, nodded, made notes in a small leather book he had produced from his waistcoat pocket. Eugenie felt the heat rising again, more intense than before. Perspiration formed on her brow, dampened her collar, ran in thin rivulets down her spine. She dabbed her forehead with her napkin, folded it, returned it to her lap. Her hands trembled so visibly that she clasped them together beneath the table, willing them to stillness. The tremor did not cease. At 12:30, the first wave of nausea struck. It came without warning, a sudden churning in her stomach that rose toward her throat. She swallowed, pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. The sensation subsided slightly, then returned with greater force. She glanced toward her husband, who was speaking to Monsieur Fontenot about cotton yields, his voice steady, his expression composed. The numbness in her feet had spread to her ankles. She shifted in her chair, testing her legs, found them heavy and unresponsive. A faint burning sensation developed in her throat, as though she had swallowed something caustic. She reached for her water glass again, drank, felt the coolness do nothing to relieve the burning. Judge Prudhomme turned to her, asked a question about the roses in the garden. She opened her mouth to respond, found that words came slowly, as though traveling a great distance before reaching her tongue. She managed a few syllables, something about the noisettes blooming early this year, then stopped, overcome by a wave of dizziness that tilted the room sideways. She gripped the edge of the table, steadied herself, waited for the sensation to pass. The potatoes arrived, creamed and seasoned with nutmeg, accompanied by greens dressed in vinegar and fatback. Eugenie accepted a spoonful of potatoes, moved them across her plate without eating. Her appetite had vanished entirely, replaced by a growing discomfort in her abdomen, a tightness that gradually intensified into pain. She pressed one hand to her stomach beneath the tablecloth, felt the muscles rigid and unyielding. At 1:45, the cramping began. It started as a dull ache in her lower abdomen, then sharpened into spasms that radiated upward toward her ribs and downward toward her pelvis. She drew in a sharp breath, held it, released it slowly. The pain did not subside. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, each contraction more severe than the last. Madame Metoyer, seated to her left, leaned closer and asked in a low voice if she was unwell. Eugenie shook her head, managed a weak smile, murmured something about the heat. Madame Metoyer frowned, unconvinced, but did not press further. The conversation continued around them. Politics, weather, the price of slaves at the Nachitoches market, which had risen since March. The burning in Eugenie's throat intensified, accompanied by a sensation of constriction, as though an invisible hand had closed around her windpipe. She swallowed repeatedly, trying to ease the tightness, but each swallow brought only momentary relief, followed by renewed discomfort. Her mouth filled with saliva, faintly bitter, and she reached for her napkin, pressed it to her lips. At 1 o'clock, the nausea returned with overwhelming force. She felt the contents of her stomach rise toward her throat, tasted bile and bitterness, pressed the napkin more firmly to her mouth. The room tilted again, more severely this time, and she gripped the table with both hands to keep from swaying. Her vision blurred at the edges, darkening as though a curtain had been drawn. Colonel Broussard's voice cut through the fog. He was addressing Judge Prudhomme, something about the bank, about arrangements that had been finalized, about documents that required witnessing. The words registered dimly, their meaning obscured by the growing chaos in Eugenie's body. She tried to focus, to understand, but another wave of cramping seized her abdomen, doubling her forward in her chair. This time, Madame Metoyer gasped. Judge Prudhomme turned, his expression shifting from polite concern to alarm. Colonel Broussard rose from his seat, walked the length of the table, stood beside his wife's chair. He placed one hand on her shoulder, asked if she could stand. Eugenie shook her head. Speech had become impossible. The constriction in her throat allowed only shallow, labored breaths. The colonel signaled to Hélène, who had been standing near the sideboard. The maid approached, her face pale, and together they helped Eugenie to her feet. Her legs buckled immediately, only their support kept her upright. They guided her toward the door, her feet dragging across the floor, each step an effort that required concentration she no longer possessed. The guests remained at the table, their conversations stilled, their eyes following the procession. Monsieur Fontenot half rose from his chair, then settled back, uncertain. Judge Prudhomme exchanged a glance with Monsieur Metoyer, neither speaking. Madame Metoyer clutched her napkin, her knuckles white. Hélène and the colonel half carried Eugenie up the stairs to her chamber. Each step sent fresh waves of pain through her abdomen, and by the time they reached the landing she was gasping, her breath coming in short, desperate pulls. They lowered her onto the bed, loosened her stays, removed her shoes. The maid fetched a basin, set it beside the bed, then stood back, her hands trembling. The vomiting began at 1:15. Eugenie leaned over the basin, retched violently, expelled a thin fluid streaked with blood. The cramping intensified, seizing her entire torso, and she cried out, a sound that carried through the closed door and down the stairs to where the guests sat in silence. She vomited again and again, each spasm leaving her weaker until she could no longer sit upright. Hélène supported her, one arm around her mistress's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that Eugenie could not process. Colonel Broussard stood at the window, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn when Eugenie cried out. He did not move when she vomited. He remained motionless, staring out at the afternoon light filtering through the live oaks, his expression unreadable. At 1:30, the diarrhea began. Hélène summoned Amélie to assist, and together they managed the chamber pot, the soiled linens, the increasingly frequent spasms that left Eugenie too weak to protest her loss of dignity. The fluid was watery, tinged pink with blood, smelling of copper and corruption. Amélie gagged, covered her mouth, continued her work without complaint. By 2 o'clock, Eugenie's skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her lips were cracked and dry despite the water Hélène tried repeatedly to give her. Her pulse, when the maid checked it at the wrist, was rapid and thready, barely perceptible beneath the skin. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, punctuated by gasps when the cramping intensified. Colonel Broussard turned from the window, crossed to the door, descended the stairs. The guests had moved to the front parlor, abandoning their meal, their faces drawn with concern. Judge Prudhomme stepped forward, asked if he should send for Dr. Laverne. The colonel shook his head. The physician was 6 miles distant. By the time he arrived, it would be too late. The words hung in the air, their implication clear. Madame Metoyer crossed herself. Monsieur Fontenot looked down at his hands. Upstairs, Eugénie's consciousness began to fragment. The room faded in and out, alternating between sharp clarity and absolute darkness. She saw Hélène's face hovering above her, tear-streaked and frightened. She saw the ceiling beams, the plaster painted white, a water stain in the corner shaped like a bird's wing. She heard voices, the maid's, Amélie's, someone else's she could not identify, but their words had lost meaning, becoming mere sound. The cramping reached a crescendo at 2:15, then suddenly lessened. The pain did not disappear but transformed into a dull, pervasive ache that suffused her entire body. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges closing inward until only a small circle of light remained. Within that circle she saw Hélène, still holding her hand, still murmuring prayers in French that Eugénie recognized but could not follow. Her breathing slowed. Each breath required effort, a conscious act of will. She drew in air, held it, released it. Drew in air again, held it longer, felt her chest constrict, released it. The intervals between breaths lengthened. 10 seconds. 15. 20. At 2:30, the breathing stopped. Hélène felt the hand in hers go slack, felt the faint pulse at the wrist flutter and cease. She waited, counting silently, hoping for one more breath. None came. She lowered Eugénie's hand to the bed, crossed herself, then rose to inform the colonel. He received the news in the front parlor, standing before the assembled guests. His expression did not change. He nodded once, thanked Hélène, then turned to Judge Prudhomme. The judge stepped forward, offered condolences, suggested that a physician should still be summoned to attend to the formalities. A death certificate, a notation of cause. The colonel agreed. Monsieur Fontenot volunteered to ride to Natchitoches to fetch Dr. Lavergne. He departed within minutes, his horse's hooves clattering on the gravel drive. The remaining guests prepared to leave. Madame Metoyer asked if there was anything she could do. Sit with the body, help with arrangements. Colonel Broussard declined politely but firmly. The household would manage. Monsieur Metoyer offered the use of his carriage for the funeral whenever it should occur. The colonel accepted. They departed together, leaving the colonel alone in the parlor. He stood motionless for several minutes, then walked to the study, retrieved the ledger from the desk, and opened it to the most recent page. The entries dated from May 22nd, the day of his meeting with Monsieur Fontenot in Natchitoches. Agreement executed per terms discussed. Documentation to follow upon event. He turned to the next page, which was blank, and wrote in his clear, precise hand, Eugénie Duplantier Broussard, deceased May 21st, 1841, 2:30 p.m. Cause, sudden illness following dinner. Dr. Lavergne arrived at 4 o'clock, brought by Monsieur Fontenot, who did not dismount but continued on toward his own home. The physician climbed the stairs to the chamber, examined the body, questioned Hélène about the symptoms. She recounted them in detail: the nausea, the vomiting, the diarrhea, the cramping, the rapid decline. Dr. Lavergne made notes, then descended to the parlor where Colonel Broussard waited. The physician's diagnosis was gastric fever, a common ailment in late spring when the heat turned food to poison and water carried unseen dangers. He had seen 3 similar cases in Natchitoches that month alone. The symptoms matched: sudden onset, severe gastrointestinal distress, rapid progression to death. He offered his condolences, wrote the certificate, accepted his fee of $15. He did not suggest an autopsy. Such procedures were rare, reserved for suspicious circumstances or legal disputes. A woman dying of fever, however, suddenly aroused no suspicion. The colonel showed him to the door, watched his cabriolet disappear down the drive, then returned to the study. He opened the ledger again, turned to the page marked Debts, Mechanics, and Traders Bank, and drew a line through the entry. Beside it, he wrote, "Satisfied per agreement, May 22nd, 1841. He closed the ledger, locked it in the desk drawer, pocketed the key. Hélène and Amélie washed the body that evening, a task performed by candlelight in the chamber where Eugénie had died. They used water drawn from the cistern, soap scented with lavender, cloths torn from old linens. They dressed her in a white gown, one she had never worn, purchased years ago for an occasion that had never arrived. They combed her hair, folded her hands across her chest, placed a rosary between her fingers. They covered the mirrors, stopped the clocks, opened the windows to let her spirit depart. The coffin arrived the next morning, brought by the undertaker from Natchitoches, a man named Thibodeau who measured the body, nodded, and promised a simple pine box suitable for rapid burial in the warm weather. Burial would occur Tuesday afternoon, following a brief service at the Church of the Immaculate Conception. Father Berard would preside. The parish would attend. It was expected. Monday passed in preparation. Celeste baked bread for the funeral meal. Hélène laundered the house servants' clothing, ensuring they would be presentable. The overseer informed the field hands, who would be given the afternoon off to attend the service, a rare concession. Colonel Broussard received visitors, neighbors, acquaintances, Judge Prudhomme, all offering condolences, all asking the same question. Had she been ill long? He answered consistently. She had been delicate, prone to ailments under Dr. Lavern's care for months. Her death, while sudden, was not entirely unexpected. They nodded, sympathetic, departed. On Monday evening, Monsieur Fontenot arrived unannounced. The colonel received him in the study, closed the door. They spoke for 30 minutes. When Monsieur Fontenot departed, he carried a sealed envelope, which he placed in his saddlebag with care. The colonel returned to the study, retrieved the ledger, opened it to a new page. He wrote, "Estate settled, title transferred, obligations discharged." He signed his name, dated it May 23, 1841, then locked the ledger away. The funeral took place on Tuesday, May 23rd, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The procession formed at Bel Ombre at noon. The hearse, a black carriage drawn by a pair of horses draped in mourning cloth, led the way, followed by Colonel Broussard and his barouche, then carriages bearing Judge Prudhomme, Monsieur Metoyer and his wife, Monsieur Fontenot, and a dozen other families from neighboring plantations. The household servants followed on foot, dressed in black armbands, Hélène walking at the front with her face veiled. The field hands had been assembled at the roadside, instructed to bow their heads as the procession passed. The journey to Natchitoches took an hour. The road, still soft from recent rains, slowed the horses and the wheels cut deep ruts in the clay. By the time the procession reached the Church of the Immaculate Conception, the afternoon heat had turned oppressive, the air thick with moisture that promised rain before evening. Father Berard waited at the church steps, vestments black, his expression solemn. The coffin was carried inside by 6 men selected by the colonel, the overseer Mathieu Gagnon, Monsieur Metoyer, Monsieur Fontenot, and 3 others whose names would not be recorded in parish memory. The service lasted 30 minutes. Father Berard intoned the liturgy in Latin, his voice rising and falling in cadences that had accompanied burials in Louisiana for a century. The congregation filled the pews, women in black dresses and veils, men in dark suits with black crepe bands on their hats. Eugénie's coffin rested before the altar, plain pine with brass handles, the wood already darkening from the humidity. No flowers adorned it. The colonel had declined the offer of roses from Madame Metoyer, citing the brevity of their beauty in the heat. The burial took place in the parish cemetery, a walled enclosure north of the church where above-ground tombs stood in rows beneath live oaks. The Broussard family tomb, purchased by the colonel in 1835, was a modest structure of brick covered in plaster, whitewashed each All Saints' Day according to custom. Father Berard blessed the tomb, sprinkled holy water, commended Eugénie's soul to God's mercy. The coffin was slid into the vault. A mason, summoned for the purpose, sealed the opening with brick and mortar. By 3:30 the ceremony had concluded. The mourners returned to their carriages. Colonel Broussard remained at the tomb for several minutes after the others had departed, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. When he finally turned away, his expression revealed nothing. He climbed into the barouche, took the reins, drove back toward Bel Hombre without stopping in Natchitoches. By evening, the household had resumed its routines. Supper was served at 7, cold chicken, rice, cornbread. The colonel ate alone in the dining room, the ledger open beside his plate. At 8 o'clock, Monsieur Fontenot arrived, carrying a leather case. The two men retired to the study where they remained until past midnight, their voices occasionally audible through the closed door, but their words indistinct. When Monsieur Fontenot departed, he carried papers tied with ribbon, sealed with wax bearing the colonel's signet. On Wednesday, Colonel Broussard rode to Natchitoches, arriving at the courthouse at 9 o'clock. He met with the parish recorder, a clerk named Dubois, who maintained the registry of property transactions. The colonel presented documents: Eugénie's death certificate, signed by Dr. Lavergne, a copy of their marriage contract, executed in New Orleans in 1834, and a deed of transfer, newly drafted, assigning ownership of Bel Hombre and its appurtenances to the Mechanics and Traders Bank in satisfaction of the outstanding mortgage. The recorder examined the papers, made notations in his ledger, affixed his seal. The transaction took 15 minutes. From the courthouse, the colonel proceeded to Judge Prudhomme's chambers. The judge received him in private, offering condolences that the colonel accepted with a nod. They discussed the estate. Under Louisiana law, derived from French civil code, a husband administered his wife's separate property during the marriage, but did not own it outright. Upon her death, her property would normally pass to her heirs, children, if any existed, or parents and siblings. Eugénie had no children. Her father had died in 1838. Her mother lived in New Orleans, in declining health. She had one brother, employed as a clerk in a cotton brokerage on Rue Chartres. The colonel produced a document, a will, dated April 15, 1841, signed by Eugénie in her wavering hand, witnessed by Hélène and Mathieu Gagnon. The will bequeathed Eugénie's separate property, jewelry inherited from her grandmother, a small tract of land near Baton Rouge gifted by her father at her marriage, and household furnishings specified in the marriage contract, to her husband in recognition of his faithful care during her illness. Judge Prudhomme examined the will, noted the date, the signatures, the notarial seal affixed by a notary in Natchitoches. He asked no questions about the timing, so convenient, less than a month before her death. Wills executed during illness were common. Foresight, not suspicion, was the natural inference. He certified the will as valid, made the appropriate entries in the probate register, and handed the colonel a certified copy. The colonel's final visit was to the office of Monsieur Etienne Cloutier, the cotton factor, whose warehouse stood on the riverfront. Monsieur Cloutier had attended the first dinner at Bel Hombre, but not the second, having returned to New Orleans. He had, however, received correspondence from the colonel in the intervening weeks. They discussed cotton futures, the expected harvest, the colonel's plans to reduce his acreage and shift to diversified crops. Monsieur Cloutier expressed sympathy for the colonel's loss, offered assistance in settling accounts, and accepted a promissory note covering advances made earlier in the season. The note would be satisfied after harvest. They shook hands. The colonel departed. By noon, he had returned to Bel Hombre. The household had continued in his absence, supervised by Hélène, who had assumed the role of head house servant now that there was no mistress to serve. The field hands worked the cotton rows under the overseer's direction. Celeste prepared the midday meal. The rhythms of plantation life, briefly interrupted by death, resumed their inexorable pattern. The first inquiry arrived 2 weeks later on June 7th. A letter, postmarked New Orleans, bearing the return address of Monsieur Henri Duplantier, Eugénie's brother. He had learned of his sister's death through a notice placed in the New Orleans Picayune by Judge Prudhomme, as was customary. He expressed shock at the suddenness, regret that he had not been notified in time to attend the funeral, and a desire to visit Bel Ombre to pay his respects. He asked delicately about his sister's estate and whether any provisions had been made for their mother, whose financial circumstances were precarious. Colonel Broussard replied promptly. He described Eugenie's illness, gastric fever, sudden onset, rapid decline, and conveyed Dr. Lavernier's assessment that nothing could have been done. He explained the funeral arrangements, the burial in the Broussard family tomb, the service conducted by Father Bérard. As to the estate, he enclosed a copy of the will, certified by Judge Prudhomme, which demonstrated that Eugenie had made provision for her property. Her separate assets, modest in value, had been bequeathed to her husband, who would, in turn, honor her memory by ensuring their mother received an annual stipend of $100, drawn from the proceeds of Bel Ombre's harvest. The letter was courteous, thorough, and left little room for further questioning. Monsieur Duplantier's response came 3 weeks later. He accepted the colonel's account, expressed gratitude for the promised stipend, and declined the invitation to visit Bel Ombre, citing responsibilities in New Orleans that could not be postponed. He did not mention the will again. Whether he harbored suspicions or whether financial necessity outweighed doubt remained unrecorded. The correspondence ceased. In Natchitoches, talk of Eugenie's death persisted through June and into July. The suddenness troubled some. The absence of children or close female relatives to grieve publicly struck others as unusual. Madame Metoyer, recounting the second dinner to her friends, described Eugenie's collapse in vivid detail. The pallor, the trembling, the way she had doubled over at the table. She wondered aloud whether Dr. Lavergne had been negligent, whether some treatable condition had been misdiagnosed. Others defended the physician. Gastric fever was common, unpredictable, and often fatal. The conversation moved on to other topics. Dr. Lavergne himself expressed no doubts. When asked, at a gathering of physicians in July about the case, he recounted the symptoms methodically. Nervous debility, treated with arsenical tonics. Periodic nausea and cramping, attributed to feminine disorders. Sudden acute gastrointestinal distress, consistent with gastric fever exacerbated by heat and dietary indiscretion. He had seen similar cases. The diagnosis was sound. No autopsy had been performed. Such procedures were rare, reserved for legal disputes or suspicious circumstances, neither of which applied. The body had been buried promptly as required by the heat. The matter was closed. Yet whispers persisted. Hélène, dismissed from Bel Ombre in August, when the colonel announced he was closing the house and traveling to Texas, spoke cautiously to a cousin in Natchitoches. She described the tonic bottle, the regular dosing, the progression of her mistress's symptoms. She mentioned the visitor who had come to see the colonel in April, the letters from the bank, the second dinner arranged so hastily. She did not accuse, she merely reported. Her cousin, a seamstress, repeated the account to clients. The narrative spread, fragmenting and mutating. Some said the colonel had poisoned his wife to escape debt. Others claimed he had conspired with the bank to sell her into slavery, a legal impossibility but a story that gained traction nonetheless. Still others suggested Eugenie had taken her own life, driven to despair by her husband's coldness. Though this version contradicted the Catholic burial, no formal investigation occurred. In 1841, Louisiana had no systematic coroner's inquest for deaths certified by a physician. The parish sheriff had no authority to pursue a case absent a formal complaint, and no complaint was filed. Monsieur Duplantier, the only person with legal standing to challenge the death certificate or the will, had accepted both. Judge Prudhomme, had he harbored suspicions, would have been obligated to refer the matter to the district attorney, but he made no such referral. The machinery of law, designed to detect and punish wrongdoing, operated only when set in motion by those with power and standing. In this case, it remained still. Colonel Broussard departed Louisiana in September 1841. He sold Bel Ombre to the Mechanics and Traders Bank, which in turn sold it to a planter from Rapides Parish, a man named Juno, who renamed it Bellevue and expanded the acreage. The house servants were dispersed. Hélène was hired by Madame Metoyer. Celeste was sold to a family in Alexandria. Amélie and Baptiste were included in the sale to Juno. The field hands remained, transferred with the land as chattel. Mathieu Gagnon, the overseer, found employment on a plantation near Opelousas. The colonel's destination was San Antonio, where he purchased land with funds whose origin was not documented in Texas records. He remarried in 1843 to a widow named Delphine Science, daughter of a ranchero family with holdings west of the Nueces River. He lived until 1859, dying of yellow fever during an epidemic that claimed hundreds. His obituary in the San Antonio Herald made no mention of a previous marriage. Delphine, surviving him by 2 decades, remarried and never spoke of her first husband's past. In Natchitoches, Eugenie's tomb was maintained by the church for 7 years until the annual fee lapsed. After that, the plaster began to crack, the whitewash to peel. By 1850, the inscription, Eugenie Duplantier Broussard, 1816-1841, beloved wife, had become barely legible. The tomb was opened in 1852 to accommodate another body, a child of the Juno family who had purchased Bellevue. Eugenie's remains were moved to a common ossuary at the rear of the cemetery. Her bones mingled with those of strangers. The story, however, persisted. In 1856, a traveler passing through Natchitoches recorded in his journal an account heard at a tavern. A planter who had poisoned his wife with arsenic disguised as medicine, escaping justice through legal maneuvering and fleeing to Texas. The traveler did not name the planter or the wife, and the details were garbled. The year given as 1838, the location as Rapides Parish. But the essential narrative remained recognizable. By the 1870s, the story had entered local folklore, told by grandmothers to warn young women of the dangers of marrying for status rather than love. The names were forgotten, replaced by archetypes: the colonel, the lady, the tonic, the dinner. The moral lessons varied depending on the teller. Some emphasized wifely obedience, others the perils of debt, still others the limits of justice when wealth and law conspired. In 1889, a historian researching Natchitoches Parish for a volume on Louisiana history uncovered records in the courthouse. The death certificate signed by Dr. Laverne, the will probated by Judge Prudhomme, the property transfer to the bank. He noted the sequence: illness, death, estate settlement, and the speed with which events had unfolded. He made inquiries among elderly residents, several of whom recalled the case. One, a woman who had been a child in 1841, remembered her mother speaking of a lady who died after a dinner, and how the servants whispered that the tonic had been poisoned. The historian included a brief paragraph in his manuscript, but his editor, concerned about libel and the reputations of families still prominent in the parish, struck it. The volume appeared in 1892 without reference to the case. Dr. Laverne, by then long dead, was remembered in Natchitoches as a competent physician, author of several papers on miasmic diseases, and a founding member of the Parish Medical Society. His prescribing of arsenical tonics, common in the 1840s, had been discredited by the 1880s, when medical understanding of arsenic's toxicity improved. But no retrospective examination of his cases occurred. No pattern of suspicious deaths emerged. If he had misdiagnosed Eugenie, it was an error consistent with the medical knowledge of his time, not evidence of malpractice. Hélène lived until 1868, spending her final years in the household of Madame Metoyer's daughter. In her last illness, she spoke of her time at Bel Ombre, recounting details to a priest who attended her: the daily tonic, the gradual decline, the terrible final hours. She said she had known something was wrong, had suspected the medicine, but had not dared speak. Who would have believed a servant against a colonel, a gentleman of standing? The priest recorded her confession in his journal, which was discovered in 1923 among papers donated to the diocesan archive. By then, everyone named in the account was dead, and the entry was cataloged as a curiosity, a fragment of antebellum life, without further investigation. In 1931, a graduate student at Tulane University, researching women's property rights in Louisiana, encountered the probate file for Eugénie Duplantier-Broussard. The will, with its convenient timing, struck her as unusual. She noted the arsenic tonic mentioned in Dr. Lavernier's certificate, cross-referenced medical literature on arsenic poisoning, and observed that the symptoms described, nausea, tremors, gastrointestinal distress, matched chronic arsenical exposure. She drafted a paper arguing that Eugénie had likely been murdered, that the legal mechanisms of coverture and debt had created the motive, and that the absence of forensic science and coroner's inquests in 1841 had enabled the crime. Her advisor, a conservative scholar uncomfortable with sensational claims, rejected the paper, advising her to select a less speculative topic. She complied. The draft was filed away, discovered decades later among her effects, and donated to the Louisiana State Museum in 1987. The museum cataloged the paper and placed it in the research collection, where it was consulted occasionally by scholars studying domestic violence, medical malpractice, or legal history. One such scholar, in 2003, used the case in a book examining unpunished homicides in antebellum America, devoting 3 pages to Eugénie's death and the legal structures that had shielded her husband. The book received modest attention in academic circles, was reviewed favorably in 2 journals, and went out of print in 2008. Bellevue, as the plantation was known after 1841, changed hands 4 more times before the Civil War. Union forces occupied it briefly in 1863, using the house as a headquarters. The house burned in 1867, cause unknown. The land was subdivided in 1902, sold to tenant farmers, later incorporated into a timber company's holdings. By 1950, no trace of the original house remained. The cemetery where Eugénie was first buried was restored in 1975 by the Natchitoches Historical Society, but the Broussard tomb, unmarked and unmaintained, was not among those preserved. The site is now covered by grass, indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. In 2019, a descendant of Monsieur Métoyer, researching family history, found a letter written by her ancestor's wife in June 1841, describing Eugénie's death and expressing unease at the colonel's composure. The letter mentioned the dinner, the collapse, the burial. It also noted, in a postscript, Madame Broussard was so very pale and thin these last months, and the medicine seemed only to weaken her further. I wonder if the physician knew his business. The descendant published the letter on a genealogy website, where it garnered 3 comments, none offering further information. The Parish courthouse in Natchitoches, renovated in 2007, houses the original records, death certificates, wills, property transfers, all preserved in climate-controlled storage. Eugénie's file occupies a single folder, her life and death reduced to a dozen pages of 19th century script, the ink faded but legible. Researchers access the file occasionally, drawn by the story's Gothic elements, the poison, the debt, the escape, but no new evidence has emerged. The case remains what it has always been, a shadow in the record, a narrative constructed from fragments, a crime suspected but never proven, a life ended and a truth obscured by the distance of years and the complicity of institutions that valued property over justice, reputation over inquiry, and silence over truth. The only certainty is the date inscribed on the death certificate, written in Dr. Lavernier's steady hand. May 21st, 1841, 2:30 in the afternoon. Cause of death listed as gastric fever, signed and sealed, and filed away in the ordinary course of business. One death among thousands in a year, a decade, a century that swallowed stories like stones dropped into still water, leaving only ripples that faded before reaching shore.